I like to say having the code but not having the coders is like having a half-written novel but not the novelist, right? Because you can imagine if one of the books you've written,
Oh yeah.
we're halfway done, doesn't matter that you have the copy. You need the logic that's in folks' heads, and so code never ends. It's exactly the same thing.
So, welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. This is Darren Pulsford, Chief Solution Architect, author, and most importantly, your host. On today's episode, Generative AI and the Evolution of Software Development, with special guest Matt Van Itallie, CEO at SEMA. Matt, welcome to the show.
Darren, thank you so much for having me.
Hey, we had an interesting conversation. Was it last week, the week before last?
Time
Who knows,
flies.
right?
Time flies, exactly.
Time flies. I was really interested in your perspective on generative AI and how it's going to change the world. So before we dive into that, every person that comes on my show is a superhero because I wouldn't have anything less. So Matt, every superhero has a background story. What's yours?
Sure. So, and thanks again, Darren. I so enjoyed our kickoff. I know we're going to have a lot of fun. I run and founded a company called SEMA, which uses data about code to understand code and help improve product delivery. I say that because I am the son of a math teacher and a computer programmer. So I was in the womb or in the household kind of destined to treat code as math, because that's definitely what I ended up doing. But I had a really circuitous path, studied history, became a management consultant, spent some time trying to improve business outcomes, and then spent some time trying to improve public sector outcomes working in school district reform, which will always be absolutely near and dear to my heart. Went from school district reform to ed tech, where I fell in love with making software and understanding, the blockers to making great software. From that, observed, I always thought about Salesforce. Salesforce is used by salespeople, but it's also used by the executive team, right?
Yeah.
To everyone, especially to manage across and up. The C-suite knows what's going on. The board knows what's going on with sales and marketing. And as a result, I believe there's better outcomes. There's better resource investment to help get to better sales and marketing outcomes. Of course, Salesforce is code about sales. It drove me nuts why there wasn't code about code that would make sense to executive audiences.
Well,
right?
That's interesting because back in the 60s and 70s, there were I got the word right this time.
You got it.
Formal methods to validate code before it would run because it would cost so much to run that they had all these formal methods to check your code mathematically. I'm sure your dad would love to hear that.
Exactly.
To check things mathematically before we, actually put them up into the mainframe. And we kind of went away from that. It's the Wild West with software, and formal methods are kind of, that slows me down. That's, doesn't work that well. You're curbing my creativity, right? That's kind of where the route it went.
We're gonna, dive into so many different levels, but I love this notion that when constraints are relaxed, you get a mixed bag of results. Some of your audience, probably many of your audience, like me, remembers what a typewriter is, and also remembers the transition from typewriter to word processor. That lowered the cost of typing because you didn't have to use whiteout, you didn't have to restart, right?
And so it also made accuracy worse.
Exactly.
The most hit key is the backspace key, right?
Exactly. And so just like the elimination of formal methods of checking correctness, because it was cheaper for processing power, they released the restriction on that. Right. Then people are going to code more. If it's easy to erase, then it's easier to type more. And of course today, if it's easy to have Gen AI write you a whole program in 2 seconds, it's easy to throw up into a repository with all this code because it's not that expensive, right? The constraints, right. Releasing constraints lets more work happen, but whether or not it's the right work is a totally separate question.
Well, something this plays well into something that happened to me. I've written 3 books. The first book I wrote, I have this tech writer friend of mine. He's great. We wrote all 3 books together. The first book we decided to self publish, and we spent more time coming up with how to fit it on the page and formatting than writing because we didn't know what we were doing. There were
Right.
no constraints. We could do whatever we wanted. Even the size of the book, we spent 3 or 4 weeks just determining the right size of the book. The second book that we wrote, um, we were commissioned to write, and they had constraints. They said, hey, when you write, these are the constraints that you have to write in. Headers have to have this on it. And it was very, very interesting. And it was uncomfortable at
Mhm.
first, but we focused just on our writing, and it turned out to be a lot faster process. The third book, we already knew the constraints, and we whipped that puppy out in like 3 months, like 400 or 500 page book in 3 months because, and this was pre Gen AI, people.
Yeah, you
This is
wrote it.
old,
You
old
wrote it.
school, right?
Yeah.
But because the constraints were there and we understood them, and we didn't worry about being creative about which font to use, who cares, right? So I think constraints can help in creativity and increase quality. It absolutely increased the quality of the books that I wrote.
Extremely well said. I couldn't agree more.
Code that helps manage code helps explain.
Yeah, yeah. So the North Star is helping code, um, is helping make code understandable between non-technical audiences and technical audiences. So not just CTOs and boards, but even engineers and
Customers.
even customers and everybody at all these different levels of technical sophistication. So let's take security warnings for a second. Security warnings inside the code itself. Those deeply technical, no, there's SAST scans and DAST scans. Um, they each play their different roles. DAST are more secure. If you are a um, if you're a company that's a year old, your code base, you're a startup that's a year old, and you have 100 high risk security warnings in your code base, something pretty weird and not good has happened. Pretty, because that's a
Yeah,
lot in a short period of time. If you are a public company and you only have a public company with thousands of developers and you only have 100 warnings,
that's
you've done
pretty
something
good.
incredibly right. You
Yeah,
have a great tool in place. Um, you have a great tool in place. Developers have time to work on it. It's amazing. And so what happened there? There's an absolute number of security warnings. Yes, of course, all things equal, better to have a smaller number. But there's the contextualized part, which is compared to a like reasonable grouping. How should I make sense of this? Folks who are, your audience understands, is a sophisticated audience listening to this. We've had to explain to less sophisticated audiences you should never get to zero security warnings on any given basis. That creates so many constraints that nothing's going to get built. You have too many
right,
constraints, but you
right.
need a commercially reasonable level of security risk based on your industry and based on your size, size and stage. And so SEMA's first product, a code scans product, was a report, kind of like a credit score or a report card, or if you take your car to a new mechanic just to make sure it's being maintained properly, use your analogy of your choice to understand how healthy is this code base on security, on IP risk, on developer retention, and those matters in a way that made sense to non-technical audiences. And that's a very real example. We take the raw data about non-functional health, like security, we
Right.
compare it to our database of, we've looked at 1.5 trillion worth of companies, and we contextualize it back to it's healthy for this size and stage, or it isn't, and if it isn't, here's how much it's going to cost to fix.
So is the health, because you mentioned this a couple of times, is the health dependent on the size of the company? I wouldn't think that would matter because in the end, if the number of vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities are the same, then it's still unhealthy or healthy
Yeah,
to a degree at the same point, right?
yeah, I think we would say it is. you can always make code more healthy, but if you're trying to explain the health of a code base to a non-technical audience, for better and worse, and I admit I find it pretty
Yeah.
persuasive, they're going to want to know commercially reasonable levels of health.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
it
yeah.
is the commercially reasonable level of health is absolutely contextual to the stage of the business. Baby companies look different from medium-sized grown-up. That doesn't mean you shouldn't resolve the 100 security warnings. But so think about this, and I didn't say this. Our number one use case when we started this business was technical due diligence. Um,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
honored to serve some of the world's best investors. Couldn't be more grateful. In that situation, while it is of course objectively true that you should have fewer security warnings, it really matters if you're buying a company that's in the first quartile, meaning healthiest relative to peers of a similar size and stage in terms of security risk and IP risk and um, these other factors. One, because it's a pretty good indication that the organization as a whole is healthy, and two, the remediation cost is meaningfully lower. I mean, we also separately calculate the remediation costs. So yes, absolutes absolutely do matter. But the first pass to
At the
explain
first
code to
pass,
a
I see that.
non-technical audience is relative.
Yeah, I see that. So I guess that's my next question is when you're doing these analysis, is it static analysis of the code or static and dynamic? Because static analysis has been around for a long time, as
Mhm.
you know. But yeah, you needed I don't know what's the right word, a Rosetta Stone to figure out how to read the results out of those. So you guys have boiled this up, made it simpler to understand. But are you doing both static and dynamic analysis, or just static analysis? And are you focusing just on security, or are you focusing on all of the normal formal methods that have been out there for decades?
Yeah. So our first product for the code scans is this point in time scan, a point in time report used in what we call moments of evaluation. Tech due diligence was the first one. We now do sell side prep because, if you can take a practice SAT, you know how much more studying you need to do to pass the real
Right, right,
SAT,
right.
right? So sell side prep, other kinds of strategic situations. In that world, in code scans, it's really important to be discreet and really easy to set up and non-disruptive. So the code scans product is static only,
Okay.
um, built for fast, discrete, non-disruptive setup. The SaaS version of this product is a continuous tool that, frankly, is a roll-up of the whatever set of static and dynamic tools that teams are using. Couldn't agree more. On an ongoing basis, you want and need um, more dynamic approaches on top of the static tools. And then, of course, I vehemently agree. That's the whole with this notion of being able to make sense of it. We did our first product, the scans, was a 100 to 400 page PowerPoint, and that was the only thing people got for 5 years. 5 years in, we were then able to turn it into a half page summary.
And that's
It
what you
was
want. No one's going to read that big
No one's
report.
gonna. Well, the technologists read it before, but we need, as Mark Twain. I didn't have time to write you a one-page letter, so I wrote you a seven-page letter.
Yeah.
We didn't have the data to write a half-page executive summary because it wasn't going to be accurate enough. But then once we had that data, yeah, I mean, all kudos to our research and design and product teams. You don't need to know. You don't need to know anything about code to know that. And so we have 7 areas. There was another question: code quality, development process consistency, developer retention. We call it a code
Oh,
base
okay. So you're not
scan.
just looking at code. You're actually really looking at the whole thing, people, process, and technology.
Exactly right. And we actually call it. Sometimes we call it a code scan, but it's really a code base scan because it's not just the code is written; it is the developers. It's the development process. It's all of those pieces coming together. Um, I think one of the things I'm most proud of in this business and in what we've built in this business is helping explain to non-technical or less technical audiences that developer retention, at least key person developer retention, is the most important driver of code base health, much more important than security warnings or tech
That
debt or
is
whatever.
really interesting.
Because of
Yeah.
course, I like to say having the code but not having the coders is like having a half-written novel, but not the novelist, right? Because you can imagine if one of the books you've written
Oh yeah.
or halfway done, doesn't matter that you have the copy. You need the logic that's in folks' heads, and so code never ends. It's exactly the same thing.
So if programmer retention is probably the number one thing, which I agree with you there, that resource. If I'm a executive, I'm looking at Gen AI going, that solves that problem. I just put Gen AI in there because those guys are those guys are replaceable. Now I'm teeing you up. I hope you hit this out of the park because I don't necessarily agree with that, but I'm hearing that from
Yeah,
executives. I'm going to replace my developers with Gen AI.
yeah. I do not agree with that, as you would suspect. There's a
Well, why
generalist.
not?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so there's
why not?
a generalist Gen AI scholar, Ethan Mollick from the University of Pennsylvania. If you are a human on Earth, you are engaged in Gen AI at this point, directly or indirectly, and so you should be reading him because he is so good, not just on Gen AI and code, but just in general. And one of the very thoughtful things he said over the last few months is that Gen AI has made intelligence cheap, while judgment, taste, discernment is still very rare and very expensive. Very rare and very expensive. And if I can give a
Right.
non-coding example for a second, um, we I was building using Gen AI to help come up with the name of a new product that is coming out in a few months that we're pretty excited about. I told it what we were planning on doing, and said brainstorm 200 different names and come back with the 10 best, and tell me why you pick them. And it did that, and it produced the 10 best. And I said, oh, I actually realized in showing the 10 you gave me, I didn't give you good instructions. Here are better instructions. Do it again. And I spent a fair amount of time coming up with an answer that really works. Um, the do it 200 times and pick the 10 best, that's intelligence. I would never do something
It
200
takes too
times and
much time.
brainstorm. It takes too much time. But the judgment of it, oh, I knew exactly what I was looking for. I knew exactly how it was right or not. That is incredibly, incredibly rare. Now, I don't want to, and by the extension in the coding world, the judgment of expert engineers matters even more than before. So medium and senior engineers, they're even more valuable because they're now all of a sudden wielding these super powerful tools that can help prototype quickly, recommend quickly, um, implement quickly. But my God, their judgment is even more important now than it used to be, because they now have this even more powerful tool at their disposal.
So that brings up an interesting dilemma, which is not everyone starts off as a senior, seasoned software engineer. So what's going to happen with all these junior guys? Where are they going to gain their experience? Because if you're saying a Gen AI can do, and I've done this myself, I've replaced before when I've had teams, I had teams as junior engineers that I would hand stuff to do that would teach them how to do things, and now the Gen AI can do that for me. They're never going to get the chance. So are we going to have this chasm of skills that then just disappears? Because eventually, seasoned senior engineers retire or die, and that's reality, right?
Yeah. So I do not have an easy answer. I happen to think that this is the most important, certainly one of the most important policy questions facing AI, which is that in every white collar field, every single one, Gen AI is currently able to, or will soon be able to, do a better job than entry level professionals. And so, what do we do for training? What do we do to get to the next generation? What do we do for employment? I happen to think that work is one of the most meaningful things we can do. I am not I am nervous about it. No, people no longer working. For ethical and self-actualization reasons. Not that some people can't live lives of leisure, but I think work is a really
It's
valuable
core to who we are.
part of
Yeah.
who we are. Yeah. And so, and I have teenagers who I don't know what jobs would be suitable for them to do in when they graduate from college. On a policy level, as a human, as a father, I'm really, 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 really concerned about not just how do we train up the next generation, but in the meantime, how do we what can they be doing to be valuable contributors to society and give back? That's on
So
the go ahead.
no, so that I mean that concern is real. So we have to go back into the schools, and I know you're passionate about school district reform. We got to go reach down into the schools. We have to elevate critical thinking, problem solving in the schools instead of generating robot machines like we have over the last 70, 80 years. On a previous podcast, I talked about this that, hey, our school districts are set up to generate workers, not thinkers. So we got to shift because there won't be the jobs out there that are just working jobs where I just turn the crank. Now I got to figure out, should I turn the crank? Why am I turning the crank? We have to start developing those critical thinking skills for sure.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
If you make it easier for me to understand code, and if I now I'm thinking my company in the future, right? I can now see what's going on better with my process. I got a dashboard. Is that what I have? I have a dashboard that I can easily see how my product development is going with my software teams.
That's
Um,
exactly right.
so I have all this visibility now. What can I do with it?
Yeah, it comes back to the previous point. You now have the data. The data is a lot easier. You have from that data insights. So an opinionated point of view on what to do, but you still need the judgment to decide on how best to carry it out. And so some of the outcomes we're seeing from early users, and we know will be coming more and more, are the right investment in technical debt reduction instead of guessing at it and guessing at it either doing too much or too little, having an honest conversation about, well, here's the real impact on the business of having the amount of tech debt that we have, which again, there is an absolute level, less is better, but there's a relative level that matters more on the business side. It means the roadmap is going to be on track, or there will be no surprises that the roadmap is off track because all of a sudden, um, I'm not saying that sales leaders, myself included, have ever changed some requirements at the last minute that might have affected when something's going to be due. But our SaaS product now says this product this initiative is now behind schedule because the requirements have changed.
So
So
so you're tracking requirements as well, and what tools are you using to track requirements? Are we just using Jira tickets or GitHub issues, or I
yeah,
mean, how are you tracking? Because that to me is one of the hardest things is grappling with the requirements because software engineers first off are horrible at estimating. We all know that. And then
estimating is hard for everybody.
yeah,
For
especially
everybody.
for software engineers because they think they could do it quicker. I'm a software engineer. I do that all the time. My wife goes, "Are you almost done in there? Dinner's ready." I'm like, "Yeah, 5 minutes." And an hour later, she's
5 minutes. Yeah, yeah,
pounding at the
exactly.
door. Right? I'm like, "Ooh, I lost track of time." But the requirements part and the customer, how are you guys capturing that? And then how are you um, analyzing that? What's the
Yeah,
trick there?
yeah. So we are combining in a process we call triangulation, what the roadmap is in the sense of what people are working on or will be working on, what the roadmap is based on what the code says, and what Jira or other project management systems say, and what board decks say or other written PDFs. And the combination of those becomes the source of truth of what did you say you were going to build and did you build it? and what do you say you are planning on building, and how on track are you? And triangulating between those to get to the real ground, truth. And that is the nature. That is a major component of our. It's the product roadmap module of our SaaS tool. Um, how we do it is some secret sauce, but I'll say am thrilled that our research team has found some pretty elegant ways to do it without without any setup. That it's
Oh,
an
that's awesome.
automated process, so not a manual mapping.
Because in the past, we've had tools like Doors, ClearQuest, where I did requirements management from documents. As you know, someone wrote this big spec on it was the good old waterfall methodology, right? Where I write this 500-page requirements document, I get it all signed off, and then I hand it over to the developers, and then 3 years later they deliver something that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So you guys are doing almost like unstructured data analysis to find out what's really going on. Uh,
Yeah,
that's
and if I
cool.
if I
That's
can
really
geek
cool.
out a little bit, because who
Yeah,
I think we
absolutely.
both know our audience is the origination for that piece of work of the product roadmap module came from a research paper about a year ago, where it was true a year ago, it's even more true now, where you could give an AI tool analyst reports and financial statements and quarterly statements from companies, and it could pick stocks better than humans,
Right. Yeah.
stocks better than humans. And we read that and thought, hmm, you know what? How you would describe these analyst reports and the financials? You wouldn't say they're unstructured. You'd say they're differently structured. Each
Yes.
one, right, is slightly different. Each one is slightly different and leaves some things out and some things don't. And hey, AI it was possible to make sense of that and come up with actions that were correct. Well, you know what's a good example of data that is differently structured and incompletely
Oh
filled
yeah.
out? Jira, right?
Oh
It's
yeah.
each board is different within a team, which is a company, much less across companies, and the level of fidelity of completion varies dramatically through no fault of Atlassian. Um, well, wow, what if, and it really was the analogy, if we could take this differently structured data and incompletely completed data and apply some AI methodologies to fill in those gaps, it solved a lot of problems at once. So we went from reading about the stock, picking stocks, to bringing this to bear on product development.
So this is really cool because you've taken code, which is highly structured, you would think. It's differently structured,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and you're taking Jira and PDFs and all the things. I think it's wonderful. You're bringing all of the data together, static analysis, dynamic analysis. I can now get a picture of where I actually sit, which we've never had before. We have the illusion that we knew what was going on, which always was tough for me to understand. Everything's all electronic. Why can't we easily see where we sit with our product development? Because everything's already digitized in most cases for software development. It's not like I have to scan things in, but
So
it's humans are in the loop and things are unstructured and
yeah,
all everywhere. So
yeah.
this is incredible what you guys have come up with.
Well, all kudos to our engineers and researchers for building it. But I will have to share a little bit more of my story. 2015, summer of 2015, three things happened to me. I switched jobs, so I went from one software company to a second software company. Company one, um, there was a very challenging discussion about the need for a refactoring. And I observed a lot of confusion between the technical teams and the non-technical teams, trying to figure out, trying to understand each other. I'm sure you've never heard that story before. Never heard that story before. And I looked at, like, sales and marketing would never argue about whether or not we need to invest in top of funnel lead generation. everyone literally understands what it means. The data is there in Salesforce, and it's just
Right.
a question of what can we afford. So the quality of that conversation between sales and marketing was so much easier, so much higher quality because of available tooling than the quality of the conversation between the tech team and the non-tech team. So that was at the first company. And then the second company, um, we spent, it's confidential, we spent a lot of time on tech debt reduction, and a lot. There was some legacy code cleanup that was necessary. And I remember thinking, why is this a surprise? Why was it all building up? Why do we not know? Right? In the first
Yeah,
case,
yeah,
why don't
yeah.
we know through data about um, the need for a refactoring and like a more objective? It still needs judgment, more objective. The second one, how do we know about? Why can't we know as an executive team about support? So remember, I said there were three things about the need for cleaning up tech debt. I said there were three things. That was the first story, the second story, and then that was the summer. Paul Ford, shout out to him, an incredible writer, wrote for Bloomberg Business Week a full issue article titled "What is Code?" And it was a little bit about the history of the code, and the sort of sub stories, but the overall arching approach was this stylized story where the man in the taupe blazer shows up and says, you need to spend an unknown but large amount of time solving a large and unknown problem involving your tech, and there's no way you can possibly know the answer to this. And it was like, the skies parted, I stepped out of Plato's cave. Oh, so this lack of knowledge about, it's a real deep understanding of what's going on with the code is not just company A problem, not just a
No,
company B problem.
it's an industry problem.
It's an industry problem, and it's such a hard problem that they'll slice, because there's so many different languages, because what does good code mean is so much more tricky than what does good sales mean. Good sales means more. Good code doesn't even mean more good, doesn't even mean more code, right? Because less code sometimes is the best work. So what we did for 7 years is get it right in one slice. Technical due diligence, where don't have to worry about SaaS, don't have to worry about continuous. Could we at least show up to someone's house, commercial house, and say it's healthy or not compared to benchmark?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that took 7 years. And now, based on that incredible work of our team and our services team, to now, we have $1.5 trillion worth of benchmarking data of all the companies we've looked at. That's the hard part. We did that the hard way, but now that benchmarking data plus AI capabilities, it's really
Unleashing everything.
extraordinary what's been unleashed.
That's incredible. Hey, Matt, if people want to find out more,
Mm-hmm.
um, where do they reach out to?
Yeah, so you can go to SEMAsoftware.com, SEMA software.com, one word. Happy to talk to any of Darren's listeners. You're now a friend of mine, MVI, Matt Van Itallie at SEMAsoftware.com. You can click on any of the links. If you say ask for me on any of the forums, happy. You'll hear from me, not from an AI bot and not from a colleague.
Oh, that's good to know. Are you real? This is not a deep fake, right? This is really Matt I'm talking to.
I've passed the Turing test, I
Are
think.
you? Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I always think of this as like, my God, it was in Boy's Life, Boy Scout magazine, 40 years ago or more, an Isaac Asimov story where aliens, cyborg robots were indistinguishable from
I
humans, and
remember
they were
this.
going. And
Yeah,
you remember what the test was, if he was a human or not?
I can't remember the test.
They asked what rhymes with orange, and the robots, their heads spun because there isn't one. Now, I take umbrage with that because I think door hinge arguably rhymes with orange, so I have a small amount of qualms.
there,
And
there you go.
but yes, it was such a pleasure, Darren. You're an
Yeah, thanks for
amazing.
coming on the show, Matt. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate your time.
I appreciate you too. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and embrace the digital revolution.